Hello everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Shed and to yet another video. This video, it's a video with a difference. Some of you have been sharp enough, right, to cop a little mannequin or a little article that I have here in the shed on display since these videos first were aired over 18 months ago, and it's this. I think you all know what this is, and yeah, I've had it I think since maybe 2008, 2009. It's Concorde, or a model of, and I'm going to give you a little talk on why I think it's probably the best invention in my lifetime, in my opinion, I think, that ever was, because I'm Jim and this is Jim's Shed. So yeah, folks, Concorde. I got this I think around 2008, and I spent, I suppose, almost 15 years working in the aerospace industry, and I've always been attached, obsessed, well, I wouldn't say obsessed, but extremely enthusiastic about modern avionics, and having spent 15 years building and assembling jet aircraft engines with a company called, back then it was Allied Signal, then it became Honeywell, then it became Garrett Engine Divisions, and it's still going, but it's, you know, owned by a company called GE, General Electric, right? And but anyway, look, I was always totally fascinated by this this aircraft called Concorde, and it was and is back then the only plane capable of flying at supersonic, more than twice the speed of sound, and it could whittle you from London's Heathrow to New York's JFK in just over 3 hours. You know, just a phenomenal feat. And I'm going to give you a little talk about, I'll just give you basically I'll talk to you about how it came about. I'll give you my opinion on the general works of the craft, and its demise. Around 2003, I think, was the last commercial flight that Concorde made, and I'll give you my reason as to why I think it became history, you know. But getting back to myself personally, the remaining, we'd say 8, 12, 14 months of my employee position at Honeywell I was then appointed, we'll say, new recruits that would come into the company as operators or operatives, had to undergo a 2-day course all about lean manufacturing, judoka, Chinese thing, you know. All about, you know, better ways of manufacturing and what lays ahead for them as future employees. And this always sat on my desk, you know, and some would say, oh, what's the story here, you know, what's this thing, you know. And there was 3 countries back in around the early to mid 60s came up with this concept of supersonic flight. British Airways, or the British aerospace industry, the French Federation of Aerodynamic, you know, whatever, and the Russians. And believe it or not, the Russians nearly got there, you know. They actually managed to get a plane off the ground. Looked not very unlike Concorde, right? But unfortunately, or fortunately, wherever way you want to look at it, it crashed during test. So basically, the Russians decided to pull the plug. So all that was left then was the Brits and the French. So in around the mid-60s, you know, both of them were coming across stumbling blocks, you know, because there's so many variables, there's so many aspects that had to be overcome to enable a passenger aircraft to fly at almost 60,000 feet at more than twice the speed of sound. And so, given that problem that they had, they decided to join forces and produce this Concorde. And it finally became a reality around the late 60s, around 68 test flights, around 66, 67, 1968. And the likes of American Airlines, Arab Air, British Airways, Air France, you know, they were all, you know, Jesus, we'll have a bit of that, you know. And they were all placing orders for this. And everything was going grand, you know, we're getting there. They had, I think it's 2 prototypes. Until, unfortunately or fortunately, the Russian also had the same thing until they crashed there, and all of a sudden, American Airlines, United Air, Arab Air, all these decided, hold on, you know, we're pulling the plug here. Fuck this. You know, we don't want them now. Jesus, we're not buying those things. So, the French and the Brits had 2 test planes, and they were also already tooled up and production set up to build, I think, their first batch of 20. I think it was around 20. So British Airways decided, I'll tell you what, go ahead, we'll fund for, I think it was £1. I don't know, I could be wrong there, but it was a very small fee anyhow. And French, Air France said, yeah, sure, look, go ahead anyway, you know. So they built 20. And I think the French took maybe 8 or 10, and British Airways ran the other 10. And it ran successfully, right, for, I think, from 69 to 2003. And just to, you know, explain this thing, you know, what was it? Well, first of all, they wanted to create a plane that was capable of travelling the same speed as a bullet. from a gun, right? I'm going to adjust the camera just a little, so that you can, you know, I can really, you know, get into this explaining. And to do that, I'm just going to remove it from its stand. It had to look like a bullet, you know. It had to be roughly shaped like a bullet. It also had to be very compact and sort of small, right? Concorde, as far as I know, was only 205 feet long. Very small aircraft. It looked big, but it wasn't. It was only 204. Boeing 747 Jumbo was like 230 feet long. Concorde was only 204, just over 200 feet long. And its fuselage, right, that's this section here, right, where the passengers were, was like no more than the width of a coach, maybe 1 or 2 feet more than the width of a coach. So which meant there were only 2 rows of seats, 2 twin rows of seats. And also it was very light. It had to be light, and it had to be very fast, extremely fast, right? And if you look at the wing structure, right, the overall width of from tip to tip, these were known as the delta wings, right? The overall width from tip to tip was only half the length of the aircraft. If you look at your average commuter aircraft, an Airbus A320, the wings are the same length, you could say, as the plane, right? And they go straight out, right? So they generate huge lift. They travel, your average commercial airline travels at about 38,000 feet. Concorde had to travel at, or travelled at, just under 60,000 feet. And it travelled at Mach 2, which is twice the speed of sound. Now it actually got up to 2.3, 2.4 megs, you know, so Mach 2 or Mach 2.5 or whatever. So the wings had to be in such a way that, you know, she could glide through the air at those enormous speeds. If they were like conventional wings, they'd just break off, you know. So if you were to look at the delta wings, right, they covered most of the structure of the fuselage for strength, and they only spanned out half the overall length of the craft. And in theory, this plane would never get off the ground. If you were to look and say, sure, that thing, you know, that thing wouldn't, how would that thing stay up, you know? And the only way they could get Concorde to stay or to get off the ground was 2 things, right? Speed, right? And angle of lift or angle of attack, right? So we'll talk about speed first. It had 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines. Now, the Rolls-Royce Olympus engine wasn't, it was a powerful engine, yeah, but it wasn't, you know, overly powerful. But what it did have was what the military call afterburners, or what the crew of Concorde called reheats. So in other words, at the tip of the engine, right, they had another set of fans where the exhaust gases came out of the back of the engine, and they injected more fuel, which ignited the exhaust gases which were coming out of the tail of of the turbine, which gave it up to 30% more thrust. So that's what you'll see, like fighter jets, the F-18 Hornet, the F-16 Falcon, the F-15 Eagle. They all have afterburners, right? But they're only used for takeoff or for a quick burst of speed, if, like, for instance, taking off from an aircraft carrier, right? So to give Concorde its that extra bit of speed, they used reheats to get it off the ground because of the delta wings, right? They didn't generate, in theory, they didn't generate enough of lift to get it off the ground, only at a certain speed. And as far as I know, P1 was 180 knots, P2 was 200 knots, and rotate was at 230 knots. That's like 260 miles an hour. Was the only time that those delta wings would create enough lift, enough, you know, at that speed to actually get the plane off the ground, using those afterburners or reheats. Once the plane was, we'll say, off the ground, as far as I know, we'll say taken off from JFK, as soon as it got around 600 feet, 700 feet, the afterburners were turned off. You still had full power, but the afterburners were turned off because you're in a built-up area. Huge noise, right? Number one. Number two, they made a serious left-hand turn, right, to get away from what do you call it? Once they left JFK and over Manhattan, right, or the right side of Manhattan, they had to take an immediate right-hand turn so that they weren't over land with all this noise from these reheats. So they turned off the reheats and made a sharp turn and continued its gradual climb. And Concorde, believe it or not, Concorde always remained climbing up to its maximum of around 59,000 feet. And as soon as it got to that, it then started its descent from 59,000 back down to its, where it, we'll say, coming into its landing pattern, where it joined normal commercial aviation heights of 35,000 feet, and then it, until it got clearance to land. So that's just roughly telling you why, you know, the wings and why it had to have afterburners, was to get it off the ground. Number two, the afterburners were then switched back on, or the reheats were turned back on once it was over the ocean. Then it could go fly up to supersonic flight. Concorde was not allowed fly at supersonic over land because of what's called the sonic boom, right? You didn't want to be hearing this massive clatter of thunder while this thing, you know, if you imagine Concorde flying at supersonic over London, 4 seconds later you had this unmerciful crackle of thunder. You can't have that, you know. So it could only fly supersonic once it got over the ocean. Then they switched on the reheats and they continued their climb all the way up to 59,000 feet at over Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. The other thing then is, if you watch video footage on YouTube of Concorde either taking off or landing, right? This model won't do it, but the nose was always tilted downwards, And it kind of said, yeah, I remember when I saw it first, just that's an ugly looking thing. Look at the state of that thing, you know. It was coming down, but the nose was like this. The only reason the nose tilted down was so that the pilots could have a view out at their runway. That's the only reason. And also they had a view of land when taking off. They had a view of their surroundings. But as soon as they got up to a reasonable height of, we'll say, 800 to 900 feet, they flicked the button and the nose went back up to its leveled position. There was so many variables that fought against Concorde to get up to Mach 2. You know, so many things that had to overcome. The people who the engineers, the aerodynamicists, the engineers, the scientists that created this were total, utter geniuses that came up with a plane that could carry, you know, 100 passengers. And that's the other thing as well, is, you know, questions were asked. Is this thing feasible? You know, is it viable? Because number one, very hard on fuel. These things burnt serious amounts of fuel in any chartered flight or whatever. And it could only carry 100 passengers, 102 I think, in around that, 98 to 102 passengers, 4 flight crew, 4 flight attendants, and 3 flight crew. So 110 souls, we'll call them, right? Also, if you look, it was divided into 2 halves. You had the front half and you had the bottom half, and you had roughly, I mean saying, yeah, 50, 51 or 50, whatever, people here and 50 people here. Or 100 here and 100 here. No, 50 and 50, 100, yeah, 100 passengers. And 2 flight crew looked after each section with regards their champagne and their caviar and whatever. Your average flight from, at the time, we'll say from London to or from Heathrow to JFK, anything up to 2.5 grand, you know. And most of the people that used Concorde were business people, mostly celebrities, musicians, artists, you know, well-to-do. You or I might, you know, the only chance we'd ever have or would have had of flying these was through a lottery or through a, you know. But the other thing then it had as well is, believe it or not, Concorde in its subsonic or in its supersonic flight actually stretched. Yeah, it stretched about 8 to 9 inches in length. So it had to have special paint, you know, special structural integrities to be able to cope with that. And you couldn't have the passengers sitting down, you know, having their soup and caviar, and the floor and the carpet starts tearing itself asunder because it's stretching. So the floor of the fuselage was actually on runners. So the floor floated. So if the outer fuselage of the plane stretched, the floor remained independent of itself on these little runners. Any of the we'll say people that flew, the pilots that flew Concorde would tell you it was a lovely plane to fly. It handled well, but very demanding. The workload was, you know, most of its avionics was there wasn't much fly-by-wire, not like it is now, right? There was cables which ran for your flight controls. There was no flight controls on the front of the wing because they basically break off. So the only, we'll say, spoilers or ailerons you had were at the rear of the plane. But what it did have is, if you can imagine you're 60,000 feet up, you could see the curvature of the earth. The air was very thin. So those huge engines, right, needed, so the way they were able to overcome that was they had little flaps on the front of the intakes of the engines that they were able to alter and create like a Venturi effect so that the engines could still power the plane to Mach 2 or over Mach 2. Ingenious, serious avionics, serious, the scientists and the people that came up with this thing was just incredible, Also, you had a captain, you had a co-captain or a co-pilot, and you also had a flight engineer. And the flight engineer was probably even more important than the captain with what he had to do. He was responsible for flicking on those reheats. But more importantly, if you can imagine a plane travelling at twice the speed of sound, right? The centre of gravity of the plane shifts. Like so, right? Or, it moves. So his job was to move fuel from tank 1 all the way, or from tank 11, which is down at the back of the plane, right up to the front, and vice versa. He had to move the fuel from the front and to the back of the plane, depending on their altitude, to keep the centre of gravity in the centre so that the plane could continue its trajectory or continue its flight. It was going so, so quick. So yeah, look, I could talk all day about this thing, but that's not the main reason. What killed Concorde, in my opinion, there were 3 factors. Factor 1 was the crash, the Air France crash in 2000 of flight 4590. 9/11, and most importantly, economics, basically. I think that's what basically killed Concorde. A lot of people will say, it was the crash, yeah, it might have been the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It might have been the catalyst, we'll say, that started, but a lot of people say, Concorde, especially the people or the employees, the flight crew, the flight engineers, the people that worked on the ground, everyone that was in the Concorde Corporation, we'll say, would all say, it should never have, they should never have pulled the plug on it. But I think it was inevitable, really, because modern aircrafts now, they're so far advanced. Concorde would never have been able to keep up with, modern avionics now. It's basically they fly themselves, But getting back to another reason or another thing, if you ever watch footage of Concorde either taking off or landing, right? Its rotational speed was around 230 knots, like 170, 210, 250 miles an hour. Serious speeds. Or sorry, 250, 260 miles an hour. The angle of attack had to be at a certain before it would actually leave the ground, and that's why the nose was always tilted so that the flight crew could see out. But also on landing, if you ever see Concorde coming into land, it's not like you'd see a commercial aircraft. You know, it comes into land like so and lands. Concorde, its angle of attack had to be roughly 30, 33, 34 degrees. The reason for that was the delta wings weren't designed to create that much lift, so it had to be at a certain angle. That's why the plane almost landed itself. If you watch videos of Concorde, especially Concorde landing, it comes in and just about 30 feet from the ground, you see the compressed air that it's creating. As soon as it comes in contact with the ground, it sent out a vortex of turbulence out from the tips of the wings as it came into the ground, you know. And on landing, it would touch down at roughly 220 knots. And believe it or not, we've all heard of carbon fibre brakes. Well, carbon fibre brakes were first introduced on this Concorde, and that's what it had. It had carbon fibre brakes to slow it down. It was very easy to slow down Concorde. Once you hit the ground, you had your reverse thrusters, okay, you had your ailerons at the back, but more importantly, you had carbon fibre brakes, and you could stop it as soon as you touched down, you could stop it very quickly after that. But getting back to its demise, yeah, Flight 4590, that was tragedy. It was, Air France. Mid to early 2000, I think it was. And that particular morning, right, that flight was chartered from Toulouse in France to New York. It was carrying 98 passengers, 4 flight attendants and 3 flight crew. I think around 108 passengers. And a lot of people say, some people, what caused it, more or less all aircraft crashes are a series of different things, combinating in one eventual disaster. And Concorde was no different. There was different factors that contributed. And I suppose Flight 4590, the first thing was, on the morning, 3 days before, that plane was in for routine maintenance. And as part of that routine maintenance, the landing gear on the left hand side of the plane, or we'll say on the port side, right, was removed. Some maintenance was done and it was put back together. However, in reassembling that landing gear trolley, there was a spacer, roughly that size, left out. The spacer was put in between the 2 front wheels on the undercarriage trolley, and it was designed to keep the wheels spaced at a certain distance apart. Not only that, it was also responsible for keeping the tracking, we'll say, of that trolley true in a fore and aft, right? However, that spacer wasn't. put back. It was left in an aircraft hangar on a shelf. And the flight engineer, when doing his walk-around check, wouldn't have been able to check that it was so far in the belly of the truck that he wouldn't have copped it. And without with that spacer in, it prevents the wheels from bobbling about like the wheels on a shopping trolley. You know, it kept them solid and straight and true. That spacer was left out, so that was the first thing. You know, anyway, on the morning of the flight, the captain decided to fill all 11 tanks up to the brim. Fill them right up. You know, we're filling this thing right up. No room, no air inside in the tanks, so he decided to fill them right up to the top. And those tanks, right, were underneath the fuselage and also in the wings. And if you have no air inside in those tanks, you know, if anything did happen, which they did, but anyhow, we'll get to that in a minute. He decided, you know, no, I want them really full to the brim. But he also instructed the ground crew to give him 3 tons of taxi fuel. You know, I think it's, 3 tons, I think. So the plane not only was full to the brim, he also took on 3 tons of taxi fuel, which he didn't need, but he took it anyway. No, you know, don't worry, we won't be long burning it off. There was also a delay, I think, of over an hour. Something wrong with one of the reverse thrusters, and the captain, rightly so, insisted on them being fixed. So he was looking at he says, we really need to get going here now, you know, it's fucking running late here. So he had 98 passengers, and this was a trip of a lifetime for these passengers, right? They were being brought from Toulouse in France, I think they were mostly German passengers, to New York's JFK, where they would then board a cruise ship, Deutschland I think it was called. It was one of the biggest cruise ships in the world at the time, and they were due to sail down by the Bay of Biscay down to the Sydney Olympics. A trip of a lifetime, you know. Oh, I think like 30,000-40,000 pounds a ticket, you know. So trip of a lifetime, very, you know. And it's important that he got in to New York on time, because cruise ships don't hang about, you know. They have a boarding window that they have to keep, you know. So he said, right, let's go, you know, we really but just before he was about to disembark the gate, one of the ground crew said, 19 bags left behind, what's the story, you know? You know, he said, what do you mean there's 19? Well, you're overweight, you know, you're over the recommended takeoff weight. Look, he says, have we room to put them in? Is there room to physically put the bags in? Now 19 bags at, I don't know, 30 kilo a bag, that's over half a ton. So not only would he be over a half a ton, he had also 3 tons of taxi fuel, and he also had the fuel tanks full to the brim. So he was grossly over the recommended takeoff weight. I throw him in anyway. He says, look, we'll, you know, if we have room, shove them in. These are, you know, we can't leave 19 bags behind. You know, these are passengers going on a lifetime cruise ship and the whole lot, and it's going to be tuxedos and you know, all the works, the whole shooting match. So, no, go on, throw them in. So they did. So he was overweight, running an hour and a half, roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours behind time. So, which meant on takeoff, the center of gravity of the plane, the flight engineer is going to have to, as it's burning fuel, he's going to have to keep pumping fuel from tank 11 up to tank 5 and 6, right? To keep the center of gravity so that he can literally get off the ground, right? So, as he was taxiing, he was told, you know, we really need to, we don't have time to go all the way up now to wherever. So they said, right, well look, runway 26 right is available. You can take that one if you want. Yeah, we'll take that one. On the ball, no bother. Only a short trip away. So his taxi run was shortened by whatever, half a mile or whatever. And these things, while taxiing, burn serious amounts of fuel, as you could well imagine, right? 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines going at 20%, 30% throttle, and these things, you know, getting ready. Serious amount of fuel being burned. But because he decided to take off on runway 26 right, he didn't burn all that taxi fuel that he put on. So not only was he grossly overweight, that runway was undergoing resurfacing. So the first 400 to 500 meters or whatever was shaved asphalt. So there was a transition from the new part, newly surfaced, from the old to the new. You know, there would have been a, right? This is where we get into the undercarriage and that spacer. So it was a quiet time of day. He was trotting along up to his takeoff point, rotated the plane, getting ready, cleared for takeoff, into a tailwind, which is not good. Concorde, as I explained earlier, you know, it was always recommended Concorde would take off into a headwind to generate. So he had a tailwind. Not really a problem, we'll say, if you're within the limits of your, you know, but he was grossly over his takeoff weight. Totally not acceptable. He couldn't, you know. So, look, you know. So, he was over 3 tons overweight. He had maybe 150 kgs of baggage. You know, so things weren't looking good. You know, things weren't. So he just, you know, so he decided to. I'm just going to boil the kettle here and have a cup of tea, you know, while I'm waiting here, you know. So now a cup of tea there as well while I'm at it. V1 is around 155 knots. V2 is 220 knots, as I said earlier on, and rotate, right, is around 230, 250 knots, over almost 300 miles an hour. Serious speed. So as the plane started its trip down the runway, it came across that, we'll say, little change of height in the runway. It, of course, obviously upset that left-hand undercarriage, and a captain of I think it was I'm not sure, it might have been an Airbus A320, noticed he was waiting to cross the runway, and he watched Concorde as it hurtled, started its takeoff run. He noticed smoke coming from the left-hand undercarriage, which means that those wheels were scrubbing the ground. They were untrue. So they were, you know, he noticed smoke coming from the tyres. Not only that, the plane was dragging so much to the left, he actually ended up driving or careering up the runway and actually went into over the hard shoulder, breaking one of the takeoff lights on the runway. And as all this is happening, right, the flight engineer is pumping fuel from the back, from tank 11 up into tank 5, or from tank 5 up to tank 11. I'm not sure which way it worked, but from the rear of the plane up into the fuel tanks in the wings, which meant there was no airspace inside in those wings, right? Just before it left the ground, that left-hand undercarriage truck picked up a small piece of titanium about 10 inches long, a strip with rivet holes in it, which had fallen off the engine cowling on a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 that morning. It cut a slice across the tyre, which was at this point overheating. A 4.5 to 5 kilo lump of rubber, right, came from that left-hand undercarriage and flew and collided with the wing. It hit the underside of the wing where tank 5 was, or tank 11, right? It hit it with such velocity it created a shock wave inside in the tank, right? That shock wave, because there was no air or no ground clear space inside, the fuel had nowhere to go. It had to go somewhere, so it burst out through the tank in around. I'll try and see if I can get a little pointer in around here, or sorry, in around here, in around there. Hope you can see that, you know, or somewhere around there. The fuel started blowtorching out. As a result of that bursting through, it obviously broke some or severed some electrical cabling for some part of the landing gear, which arced and ignited that fuel that was rushing out of tank number 5, right? And as it came in contact with the engine, right, everyone thought the engine's on fire, but it wasn't. It was the fuel that was being blowtorched out of the tank that actually ignited, and the engine was ingesting all that, both fuel, burning fuel, right? It in turn set off a fire alarm inside in the cockpit, and any, we'll say, flight crew will tell you, you turn off the fire alarm and you assess the situation. Number one, when you have a problem, if you're at the point of rotate, you have to take the problem up into the air. You've no choice. You're past the point of no return, right? But they didn't. The flight engineer shut off that engine, shut it down, right? So that engine, albeit it was creating power but not enough, but it was generating power, but he decided to ignore the alarm and just shut off the engine, because the engine, as he thought, was on fire. It wasn't. It was the tank. It was the fuel coming out of that tank number 5 that was actually on fire. The plane was at this point around 50-60 feet off the ground, and as it was tilting to one side because there wasn't enough lift being, or there wasn't enough what do you call it, thrust being generated by that engine that was shut down. The plane just wasn't getting off the ground as it should. It clipped, it didn't touch, but it barely missed a jumbo 747 that was also taxiing, that was after coming in to land previously, which, believe it or not, was carrying the president of France, Jacques Chirac, and his wife from some business trip somewhere. And the pilot of that plane said it barely missed them by 20-25 feet, right? I think the plane, it got no more than 200-300 feet off the ground, and unfortunately gravity won in the end. It collided with a hotel 2.5 kilometers outside the airport, and killed, I think, four or five people on the ground and all the passengers on board. So roughly 115 people lost their lives that day. You know, it was just all those little things that led, you know, it just all, you know. If he had to keep the power on, would he have generated? Yeah, but was it, you know, if he had to turn off those pumps to stop filling those tanks, keeping those tanks topped up, would that, you know, would it just, that tire hit and just, it might have just shook around a bit and settled itself? There's loads of little, you know, so a lot of people say, oh, the piece of steel did it. Well, it did, but a lot of other things as well, and poor decisions. You know, it's unfortunate to say, but it did, you know. So I think that was, as a result of that, I think the whole fleet, I think British Airways were running at the time, around 2000, were running, I think, 5 or 6 Concordes, and I think Air France were running 3 or 4. All Concordes were grounded, but as a result of that, a serious amount of money was spent. Number one, reinforcing the fuel tanks. Number two, better tires. Number three, you know, better procedures were, you know, and as also all Concordes, well, all British Airways Concordes were refitted out with plush leather and the best, you know. But then 9/11 happened, and a lot of passengers, especially from is it Kulik Fitzgerald Insurance Company or bankers, a lot of their employees were passengers that would have used Concorde. They lost their lives in Tower 2, I think, in 9/11, and they were regular users of Concorde. And then I think economics decided, I think the last commercial flight of Concorde was in around 2003, and a lot of them at the time was, oh, this shouldn't happen, you know, and maybe it shouldn't, but I think economics would have caught up in the end, and it eventually would have, because Concorde would never have been able to keep up with modern avionics. But getting back to this, it's, in my opinion, it's probably the best, the most incredible aircraft that ever was produced. And I have to say well done to British aviation and French aviation for creating such an incredible aircraft. You know, you could get up in London, right, 20 kilometres outside London. You could get up at 8 o'clock, have your breakfast, have your shower, have your breakfast, get a tube or whatever to Heathrow, stroll away without any great ease, you know, any great pressures, and board a flight at 11 o'clock or 10:30 and land in JFK and still in time for work at 9:30 the same morning. You know, such was the pure genius of this, you know, incredible thing, incredible. I was always infatuated with Concorde, you know, I still am, you know, and what I would recommend you do is check out, there's a guy called John Hutchinson, I think. He was a captain on one of these. I think it's Alpha Bravo. There was Alpha Bravo, there was Alpha Tango. British Airways named them, you know, had a name on each of their 5 or 6 fleet. But all those pilots were trained here in Shannon, in Ireland, believe it or not. Because Shannon, being down on the southwest of Ireland, was just literally on the edge of the Atlantic, which means you could take off from Shannon and they had a whole big ocean to do all the training they wanted to fly a supersonic all day long if they wanted to, you know. All their training, and as far as I know, I think it was a 6 months training program that all those flight engineers, co-pilots, you know, that were all had to go through. All that training was done in Ireland, in Shannon. And yeah, I'm going to have a cup of tea now and reminisce. I'd ask you to check out this guy, John Hutchinson. He was, I think, 12 or 13 years flying Concorde. He was one of the captains. There was many captains, but he's the most, we'll say, recognisable. Check out YouTube and some of his videos where he can talk to you a lot better than me. I'm only this is Jim's Shed, you know. But I was always infatuated with this, and still am, and always will be, you know. Will we ever see a supersonic flight again? Yeah, probably. I don't know. In my lifetime, I don't know. I suppose during COVID you could say definitely not, you know, because everybody was zooming, you know. But now that COVID is, thankfully, a thing of the past, right? A lot of these big corporations, we're fed up with this Zoom. We really need to get, you know, will we see, you know, supersonic commercial aircrafts again? I don't know. We might. Maybe if airline companies start introducing advertisement on their fleets, then we might. Buses carry advertisements on their fleets, taxis, some trains do, not a lot, but some do. Aircraft don't. It's, you know, I think until the day we see that happening, then we might see more revenue being generated through commercial flight. But yeah, look, you know, it's a great story, it's a sad story, it's a fascinating story, but you know, it's, thank you very much. You know, I hope you enjoyed my little talk on Concorde. Yeah, don't forget, like, share and subscribe to the channel, and until the next one, thank you very much for watching. And Jesus, this video is almost an hour long. Bloody hell. Anyway, tell her how time flies when you're having, I talk all day on these things, you know, but look, you know, back to the, I'm actually in the process of fitting Belstein shocks and springs in Jan Mini. So that's what I'm at the moment. So anyway, yeah, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this little talk. And until the next video, thank you very much. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe and comment. And we'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.